I've spent most of my adult life watching how power actually operates, not the way it's described in press releases or political slogans, but the way it moves quietly through institutions, agreements, and systems that most people never think about until something breaks. And what we're witnessing right now with the United States supply chain is exactly that kind of moment, the kind historians will eventually point to and say this was when the consequences finally became impossible to ignore. Because while Washington was busy treating Canada like just another opponent to be pressured, Canada made a decision that struck directly at the infrastructure holding the American economy together. And the effects are already rippling through factories, energy markets, construction sites, and boardrooms across the country in ways that no amount of spin can conceal. Because this isn't a trade spat that can be walked back with a tweet or a press conference. This is the real world collision between political recklessness and economic reality, and it's happening faster than anyone in the administration expected. For more than 70 years, the United States and Canada built what is arguably the most deeply integrated trading and production relationship on Earth. Not because of ideology or sentimentality, but because it made economic sense to treat North America as a single production ecosystem where raw materials, components, and finished goods moved back and forth seamlessly, sometimes crossing the border 5 or 6 times before reaching a consumer. And that system worked precisely because it was boring, predictable, and governed by rules that didn't change based on the mood of whoever happened to occupy the Oval Office. But that assumption of predictability has been systematically dismantled over the past year as Donald Trump returned to power with a worldview that treats trade not as an ecosystem to be managed, but as a battlefield where humiliation and domination matter more than outcomes. And that worldview finally collided with a hard limit when Canada was presented with an ultimatum that no sovereign country could accept without surrendering its economic independence. What triggered this moment wasn't a misunderstanding or a technical dispute. It was a demand, a final demand, as the administration framed it, that Canada agree to restrict exports of critical materials unless American companies were given preferential access at below market prices. And it's hard to overstate how radical that demand actually was because it wasn't about addressing shortages or stabilizing markets. It was about forcing another country to sell its resources at a loss to satisfy a political narrative in Washington. And when Canadian officials looked at that demand, they understood immediately that compliance wasn't just economically damaging, it was existential. It would have set a precedent that Canada's sovereignty could be overridden whenever an American president decided pressure was useful. And that is the line Canada refused to cross. What followed was not retaliation in the dramatic sense people imagine when they hear about trade wars. There were no immediate blanket tariffs, no emotional speeches about revenge. Instead, Canada did something far more consequential. It withdrew from voluntary supply chain coordination agreements that only function when both sides trust each other to act rationally. And by doing so, it exposed just how fragile the American production model has become after decades of just in time manufacturing that assumes parts will arrive exactly when needed and never considers what happens when a trusted partner decides that trust no longer exists. Within hours of the announcement, the effects began cascading through the system. Automotive plants in Michigan and Ohio received notices that shipments were being delayed indefinitely. Not canceled, not banned, just delayed in ways that destroy production schedules because a delay of a few days might as well be a shutdown when you have no inventory buffer. Construction firms found that Canadian steel and lumber shipments weren't clearing the border on the timelines their contracts were built around. And energy markets reacted immediately as traders realized that guaranteed minimum flows of Canadian oil and natural gas were no longer guaranteed at all, introducing uncertainty into pricing models that depend on stability above all else. This is where the administration's fundamental misunderstanding becomes painfully clear, because size does not equal leverage in an integrated supply chain. The country that controls critical inputs at key points often holds far more practical power than the final market. And Canada sits at precisely those choke points for energy, minerals, automotive components, and construction materials that American industries cannot easily replace. Not in weeks, not in months, and in some cases, not without massive capital investment that takes years. And yet the ultimatum was issued as if Canada had no choice but to fold, as if the asymmetry of GDP alone guaranteed submission, ignoring the reality that modern manufacturing is a fragile choreography where one missing component can idle an entire facility. As the disruption spread, something unusual started happening in corporate America. Executives who had stayed silent through previous trade threats began making frantic calls to Congress and the White House, not to debate ideology, but to explain operational facts, that factories would shut down within days, that workers would be furrowed, that competitors in Europe and Asia not dealing with this chaos would permanently capture market share. And those warnings weren't hypothetical. They were accompanied by data, timelines, and inventory counts that showed just how little margin for error exists in the current system. The Chamber of Commerce issued emergency statements. Manufacturing associations released projections showing hundreds of thousands of jobs at risk within weeks. And suddenly, the consequences of treating trade policy as a performance art became impossible to ignore. Because when a factory stops, there's no narrative that fixes it. When a worker is sent home, there's no slogan that pays the bills. And when energy prices spike because supply certainty evaporates, consumers feel it immediately. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is that it follows a pattern we've seen before, a pattern where threats are issued without an exit strategy, whether it was tariffs on China that ended with American farmers needing bailouts or border threats against Mexico that nearly shut down supply lines before business pressure forced a retreat. But Canada is different because the level of integration is deeper. The reliance is more absolute, and the political will to submit simply does not exist. And that combination creates a crisis that cannot be managed with bluster. As the administration's own political coalition began to fracture under the weight of real economic harm, Republican senators from affected states publicly demanded resolution, labor unions warned of imminent layoffs, and business leaders who once praised Trump's toughness started distancing themselves, not because they suddenly discovered principles, but because their balance sheets were bleeding. And this is the point where the spectacle of strength collides with the substance of governance, because dominance that produces collapse is not strength, it's failure. The deeper problem, and the one that will outlast this immediate disruption, is that Canada's response sent a message not just to Washington, but to every American ally watching closely, that economic integration with the United States now carries political risk that cannot be managed through normal diplomacy. And once that lesson is learned, it doesn't unlearn itself. Companies adjust, governments diversify, supply chains route, and the world quietly begins building systems that do not depend on American reliability, because reliability is the true currency of power, and it's being squandered in real time. What we are witnessing is not simply a standoff between two governments. It's the exposure of a structural vulnerability that was always there but never tested at this scale. The vulnerability of an economy that assumed cooperation would always exist, even as it elected leaders who openly contempt that cooperation, and the consequences of that contradiction are now arriving faster than anyone planned for, reshaping incentives, alliances, and calculations across North America in ways that will not be easily reversed, because once trust is replaced with contingency planning, the old system never quite comes back the same. What makes this moment so destabilizing for Washington is that there is no clean exit, no graceful way to reverse course without acknowledging failure. Because the entire strategy was built on the assumption that Canada would ultimately blink, that economic asymmetry alone would force compliance. And when that assumption collapsed, it exposed how little contingency planning existed behind the bravado, leaving the administration trapped between two equally damaging options: escalation or retreat, both of which carry real political costs that can no longer be hidden from the public. If Trump doubles down and imposes the comprehensive tariffs he threatened, the supply chain damage accelerates. Factories that are already teetering shut their doors entirely. Layoffs spread from the industrial Midwest into energy and construction sectors. prices rise further, and the narrative that this is all a temporary negotiating tactic collapses under the weight of lived experience. Because Americans notice when their plants close, when projects stall, and when their cost of living rises. And those are not abstract metrics that can be explained away at rallies. But if Trump attempts to de-escalate, to quietly walk back the ultimatum or negotiate a compromise, he faces a different kind of reckoning because his political identity is built on the idea that he never backs down, that threats always produce submission. And that perception of dominance is central to his appeal, meaning any concession to Canada will be framed by critics and eventually by his own supporters as proof that the strongman posture failed when confronted with a sovereign nation willing to absorb short-term pain to protect long-term independence. And this is where the damage extends beyond the immediate economic shock and into the realm of institutional credibility, because allies around the world are not evaluating this crisis based on press briefings. They are watching outcomes. They are watching whether the United States can sustain integrated partnerships without weaponizing them, and whether American leadership understands the difference between leverage and self-harm. Inside Washington, the cracks are widening in ways that are deeply uncomfortable for a system already strained by polarization, as trade experts who warned against this course are now being proven correct in real time, while lawmakers scramble to distance themselves from a policy they did not design but now must answer for, and the constitutional imbalance that allows a single executive to unleash this level of economic disruption before any meaningful check can occur is being scrutinized more intensely than it has been in decades because the courts move slowly. Congress is paralyzed and the consequences are immediate. What Canada did, intentionally or not, was force the issue into the real economy, where ideology matters far less than logistics. And once the crisis enters that space, it becomes impossible to confine it to talking points, because trucks not crossing the border do not care about political messaging, energy flows do not respond to rhetoric, and manufacturing lines do not pause politely while leaders recalibrate their narratives. The most consequential effect of this confrontation may not be what happens next week or next month, but what happens quietly afterward as American companies begin redesigning their supply chains to reduce exposure to political volatility, sourcing components elsewhere, even at higher cost, building redundancy instead of efficiency, and shifting investment to jurisdictions where policy predictability still exists. Because once those decisions are made, they rarely reverse, and the integrated North American economy that took generations to build begins to fragment not with a bang, but with 1,000 quiet recalculations. Canada understands this dynamic, which is why it is not waiting for Washington to resolve its internal contradictions, but accelerating efforts to diversify trade, deepen ties with Europe and Asia, and ensure that no future American ultimatum can carry the same systemic threat. Because the lesson learned here is not theoretical, it is practical. That dependence on a partner who treats interdependence as leverage is itself a vulnerability that must be mitigated, and American allies are learning the same lesson, drawing conclusions that extend far beyond Canada. Because if the United States is willing to issue ultimatums to its closest neighbor, a country with shared language, values, and the longest peaceful border in history, then no ally can assume immunity from similar treatment. And that realization will shape diplomatic and economic strategies for years to come. The tragedy of this moment is that none of this was inevitable. The supply chains did not break because of natural disaster or unavoidable crisis. They broke because political theater was elevated above institutional stewardship, because complexity was treated as weakness, and because dominance was pursued without regard for the systems that actually sustain prosperity and security. The people paying the price are not the architects of the policy, but workers sent home from idled plants, small businesses unable to get materials, families facing higher energy costs, and communities watching decades of economic integration unravel through no fault of their own, while those responsible remain insulated from the immediate consequences of their decisions. And that disconnect between decision makers and those who bear the cost is precisely what makes this crisis so corrosive to democratic accountability. Because when power can inflict harm without immediate consequence, trust erodes not just internationally but domestically as well. As this situation continues to unfold, the fundamental question facing the United States is not whether it can force Canada back to the table, but whether it can relearn the discipline required to manage power responsibly in a world where leverage cuts both ways. Because strength without restraint becomes self-sabotage, and unpredictability masquerading as toughness ultimately drives partners away. What Canada's refusal accomplished was to expose that reality in the clearest possible terms, demonstrating that sovereignty still matters, that trust is finite, and that even the largest economies cannot bully their way through systems they themselves helped create. And once that truth becomes visible, it does not disappear when the headlines move